If there was ever a game that could be described as one of a kind on the NES, it's StarTropics. There are many reasons for this, mainly the relatability of the main character and the time and place it occurs. It swaps the science fiction and fantasy settings of many other titles for a more contemporary one. You play as Michael Jones, a teenager who gets an invite to visit his famous archaeologist uncle he's never actually met before. The first time I read Mike's little journal entry as he poured out his excitement and anxiety about traveling, it reminded me of the feeling I used to get as a kid after the school year ended and I had a family vacation looming on the horizon. There was so much anticipation back in those days about what kinds of adventures we'd have or how I'd survive away from home without all of those 1990s luxuries like listening to my Discman, watching Saturday morning cartoons, or playing Faxanadu for the millionth time. In Mike's case, he's a baseball star who would be traveling alone to an unknown tropical island with an even lesser-known relative with zero idea of what to expect when he arrived. Does this place even have electricity? When he arrives at Coral, ready to embrace some fun in the sun, Mike learns that his uncle's been abducted. The villagers, even though they live there and clearly know the lay of the land better than a foreigner, decide that their guest is the best guy for the job of rescuing his uncle from his captors. And with that, Mike soon finds himself on a proper adventure. It wasn't completely lost on me that Mike's famous archaeologist uncle was named Dr. Jones. His first name's Steve, but it doesn't take a whole lot of mental digging to triangulate the inspiration for that character's last name. Anyway, StarTropics is divvied up into chapters and has two different game modes. In the first, you explore around and chat with people on the islands to gather information in the travel stages. The second are the battle stages, where the action happens, featuring all of the treacherous combat and tricky dungeon design your heart could ever desire. This gameplay mashup struck a perfect balance between downtime to move the story along and the intensity of the platforming sections, making the ebb and flow of the experience nice and rhythmic. Speaking with the locals was a pleasant experience. The fact that StarTropics was only released for English-speaking regions was such a breath of fresh air on the NES, and very welcome as well. It was a nice contrast to other questionably translated games that I've played where the meaning and intention is muddied up pretty badly. Even though the writing was practically crystal clear, one little quirk was the occasional omission of punctuation. When you're speaking with someone, once in a while they won't end their sentence with a period, making their statements a bit bumpy to follow. This usually happened at the end of a dialogue box before flipping to the next part of the conversation. For someone playing on their own, this probably isn't a big deal, but when I was live streaming and reading all of the dialogue out loud, it was hard to know if sentences were ending or if there was more information coming. I stumbled through a lot of this, which kept me laughing and on my toes for most of the playthrough. I honestly wish they would have just punctuated everything properly, since there didn't seem like any reason not to. In many cases, there was clearly a space to put a period, and this took a few points off of what's otherwise a very well-written game. Even though the troubling news of Mike's uncle's disappearance is the thread that ties the whole adventure together, many of the little plot stops along the way are comparably lighthearted. The island people are pretty laid back and will request your help for things like finding medicine or tracking down lost villagers. These little side quests were short and sweet and did a great job of tying into the battle stages meaningfully. One of my favorite aspects was that because each chapter is isolated from the ones before and after it, there's no requirement to remember details about these interactions whatsoever. This made StarTropics so different from bigger adventure games I've played, where you need to keep track of tiny fragments of character interactions across many hours. Here though, everything gets tied up neatly by the time each leg of the game comes to a close, auto-saving as you move along. You can't go back to previous chapters within your own save file, but there is an option to use review mode on the load screen. All it does is allows you to play through a previous chapter from its beginning, so I'm not really sure what its purpose is apart from hearing conversations a second time or replaying some of the battle stages without having to run through the whole game from the start. It doesn't modify your actual game save in any way, so it's not like replaying a section gets you more points or ahead somehow. I was happy to kiss each past area goodbye for good, and felt no need to repeat earlier areas. It's cool that you can if you want to, though. Keeping the chapters separated from one another paved the way for some rather puzzly additions to the travel stages. Because there wasn't a huge open world to fret over, it seems that the developers decided to kick up the challenge of simply getting around. For example, a row of mountains might actually be fake and lead to the other side of an island, but the only way to discover this is by trying to walk into them. Off land, you also have your own personal submarine to sail the not-so-open waters and look around that way. I really liked how anything was possible here, and this less than straightforward searching worked well in this bite-sized chapter format. If something like this had been implemented in a massive open overworld game with frequent random enemy encounters plaguing your exploration every few moments, it wouldn't have been nearly as fun. But here though, it was great since the threat of battle was contained in a different game mode altogether, leaving me with a clear head to do the extra thinking required to make progress. Now, while most of these travel stage passages are easy enough to find, I'm pretty embarrassed at how long it took me to realize that your submarine doesn't innately have the ability to submerge when you first get it. The manual says so in black and white, but I must have missed that during my read-over. The first time I saw the darker water tiles, I'm pretty sure I tried every single button combination on the NES controller I could think of trying to dive down to no avail. Though there are some really interesting scenarios in the travel stages, the submarine issue was the only time where I truly felt stuck, but it was entirely my own fault for not familiarizing myself with the manual's content. The bulk of the adventure takes place in the battle stages, where you rummage through dungeons and engage in what I consider to be some pretty unique gameplay elements. StarTropics isn't as straightforward as other adventures, since nearly every room has some kind of problem-solving element to it, but it's different than just pushing blocks around. You might have to kill all the enemies to open a door, squint at walls looking for secret passages, or jump on tiles to reveal switches that open locked doors or chests. Yeah, if you thought that you could just walk up to a chest and take its contents without working for it, you thought wrong. Every bit of progress in this game is hard fought in one way or another. What kept StarTropics engaging for me right through to the end was the sheer volume of things to try and the way their complexity kept increasing. Each battle stage got longer and tougher, striking me differently than other games that keep the difficulty even across the whole experience. The latter tends to make the beginning of a game really nasty and the back half too easy. A great example of this is Kid Icarus on NES. The first few levels absolutely wreck you, but later on, once you've upgraded your weapons and your health bar, things smooth out. In StarTropics, even though your health meter consistently grows, by the time you get close to the end, the game doesn't do you any favors and forces you to get good if you ever want to see the ending. I'd say around 80% of my playtime was spent memorizing and repeating the battle stages after losing all my lives. The idea of lives in a game like this was intriguing to me. Each time you continue, you only get 3 to make it all the way through to the end of a dungeon. There were regular opportunities to gain an extra life or 2 with these little try your luck signs, but I soon grew wary of them. A couple of times when I picked one up, I actually spun a negative number and felt demoralized as my life count got reduced. When you only have 3 lives to your name to begin with, losing one feels like a kick in the teeth, especially since I needed all the help I could get. I don't think having a 3-life limit was innately a bad thing, but it did make the climb to the end of many battle stages a steep one. A reason for this is because whenever you game over and continue, all your progress in a battle stage you're currently working on is undone. It's like you've never been there before. You have to fight all of the respawned enemies, open up the locked doors again, rediscover all of the secret items, all the while doing your best to not make the same mistakes that got you killed the first time. Practice obviously makes perfect, but from a fun standpoint, it got extremely repetitive after a while. I know that this isn't really all that different from other games, but there were some elements to these dungeons that made them feel extra frustrating and tedious to work through. I'll talk about the combat in a moment here, but one thing that really squeezed a lot of my lives out of me was how downright mean-spirited the battle stage rooms could be. One such gimmick was that some of them were completely dark. You can light them up if you found the right magic items, but those weren't always available. Occasionally, you'll be able to scope out an enemy's movement pattern for clues about where to land safely, if you're lucky. Getting to a new area usually meant that I'd jump straight into the sweet clutches of death many times before finding the correct path, and eventually, I begrudgingly gave in to that new normal. The worst situations for this by far were the handful of times that the simple joy of exploring got me killed. On one particular occasion, I had a branching path to contend with, chose blindly, and ended up taking an eternal lava bath. The first time through here and several other trap rooms like this, there isn't any indication as to which route will lead you to your demise. It's complete trial and error, and once you know, you'll hopefully know better for next time. I really feel this kind of gameplay is unfair. Dying because I wasn't skilled enough, or maybe because I badly timed a jump is one thing, but transitioning to a room that was intentionally designed to take a life away felt dirty. This was one of the only aspects of the game that truly got under my skin, especially with how much exploration was needed on a first playthrough with no guide. It was easy enough to laugh things off in the moment, but I learned not to trust anything early on in my adventure. Unfortunately, leaps of faith, even if they were deadly ones, were necessary to inch my way closer to the end of the game. Another thing I struggled with initially was the control scheme, which took some getting used to for me. Mike moves on a grid with the D-pad just fine, but whenever you want to switch directions, there's a bit of a delay. The turning part is instantaneous, but if you're holding down the D-pad, there's a brief moment before he'll start walking, leaving you vulnerable to attacks. When I had all the time in the world to sit and think about how I'd like to move through a room, this wasn't a problem for me. But under the gun, when enemies were everywhere and my reaction time actually mattered, that was usually a recipe for death. I found it really hard to be proactive instead of reactive here, since the monsters you fight can be hard to anticipate. The enemy design in StarTropics was fairly run-of-the-mill. All of the regulars are here, like jellies, radishes, noctos, and loopers. The undead showed up to the party as well, which I thought was a nice touch considering we're crawling around ancient ruins, and it's expected that we'd wake up some of the former residents. I should take a moment to mention how great the manual art for the enemy roster is here. Lots of NES booklets do a decent job illustrating different monsters, but the art style here feels more visually interesting than usual. The fact that the pictures are actually in color helps a lot, since so many of these things were printed in black and white. Glancing through these was a real treat. There was all sorts of variety in how enemies behaved. Some stuck to movement on a grid pattern and mostly kept to themselves, but others would hunt you down with a fiery passion, like these bonehead enemies. They're described as mutant ostriches in the manual, and when you get close to them, they start chasing you. One terrifying aspect of enemy movement in StarTropics is that many of them can jump across obstacles rather than having to go around them, meaning that they're always right behind you. The thing that tripped me up the most about the fighting was that there never seemed to be enough time to react because of that movement delay I mentioned earlier. Turning to face them and getting a few hits in was fine, but retreating without getting pecked a bunch felt practically impossible. And these are just an example of one monster type that moves in a straight line. There are plenty of others that are faster, with diagonal attack patterns that drum up way more anxiety than this. The standard yo-yo weapon, only attacking in 4 directions, is the crux of the issue here. If there were multiple flyers in a crowded room, it was rare for me to escape with more than a shred of life left, if I even made it out alive at all. You had to anticipate where they were going to be rather than aiming for them directly, which I found tough to do consistently. Hitting monsters only slows them down for a split second with no knockback, and as soon as they recover, they'll be back to their original path and show you no mercy if you happen to be in their way. And with some of these crazy patterns, it's really hard not to be in the way most of the time. Mike does have a short iframe window, but without many options to retreat in some of the more complex rooms with lots of water gaps, it was a bit too easy to get cornered and take damage multiple times. Regaining health is possible, but compared to other games, health drops from enemies are few and far between. There are a couple of ways to increase your life, with one being through collecting stars. Get this, to get a single heart back on the meter, you need to pick up 5 of them. This is so stingy. If you're clinging to the last vestige of health in your meter, you'll probably die long before successfully killing 5 enemies that each drop a star, making this system feel like a cruel joke. Full hearts can appear, and there are occasionally multiple heart piles lying around for the taking at the cost of some precarious platforming, but these infrequent and piddly little handouts were just not enough to keep me alive until I buckled down and had practically memorized the battle stages. It also doesn't help that when you lose a life, you come back with just 3 hearts to your name. This is not atypical of games from this era. The Legend of Zelda, Metroid, or even Milon's Secret Castle did this too, but at least in those titles, enemies drop health a lot more often and respawn way more regularly. That's just not the case here. It really felt like you couldn't be anything other than perfect to even have a chance of getting through each of the battle stages. Only a couple of mistakes could send your spirit skyward, and sometimes that reality made me want to send a few screams into the sky after it. The base weapon is eventually upgraded to stronger iterations with a projectile, but there was a catch to this. Crossing certain health thresholds could power your weapon down to a weaker version if you got hit a lot, with the base yo-yo being the wimpiest. The only other time I've seen something similar is in Newtopia for the TurboGrafx 16, where the main character's amount of health impacts how strong his fire wand magic is. I actually love this idea in principle. It rewards good playing and should theoretically help you keep your distance from most monster types. Given how much trouble I had hanging on to my life though, in practice I was almost always playing at a disadvantage with the yo-yo. That was definitely more a me problem and not so much a fault of the game design whatsoever. One saving grace was the sub-weapon lineup, but even with all of their variety, barely any of them addressed the problem of enemies moving on a diagonal. A lot of them are great for distance, but the baseball bat is pretty much the only one that will hit monsters from all angles. I found it pretty funny that the manual took the time to show you what all of the options are, but it didn't bother actually describing their function. It should have been straightforward, but sometimes I'd pick up one of these and try it out, only for it to do nothing. One such circumstance was when I was attempting to murder these squids across some water with the Wonder Horsehide balls. After throwing a few and not seeing any results, I figured out that I needed to equip the spike shoes instead. Why the baseballs didn't work, I have no idea and never will. I suppose each dungeon only provides you with a handful of options, so there's not too much to think about. But describing a little bit about each item would have at least filled in some of this blank white space on the manual pages, if nothing else. I took advantage of the sub-weapons most often when I was working through boss fights, but for most of the battle stages, I didn't use them nearly as often as I probably should have. A reason for this was how all-consuming regular combat was. You can actively swap between weapons using the select button, but paying attention to that little menu at the bottom while fighting simultaneously proved to be tough to balance for me. There was a second option to pause and change in the menu instead, but it really broke up the flow of the action and I rarely bothered with it. Since I didn't use my sub-weapons regularly, you might think I ended up with a mighty horde of them by the end of the game. Unfortunately, you don't carry them forward with you between chapters, so it's a use it or lose it situation. Items for combat are actually supplied in abundance, but you have to find them through exploring. There's no such thing as shopping in towns in StarTropics, even though you visit many places and speak with lots of different people all throughout the adventure. You're at the mercy of what the battle stages giveth, and in hindsight, knowing how many sub-weapons I had left over at the end of most battle stages makes me wish I used them more often. If I do replay StarTropics in the future, I probably won't hesitate to put them to work. The boss fights in StarTropics were very enjoyable for me. They were as unconventional as the puzzle design in the battle stages, and required way more thought than just smacking something until it croaked. This variety infused quite a bit of strategy into the mix as well, especially because of how specific the main character's movements had to be. I just couldn't run all over the place on solid ground dodging like I could in other games. I had to carefully time my jumps to get away to safety or avoid projectiles, which was much easier said than done. Most of my first-time forays into these rooms resulted in instant death from getting sniped by a stray fireball I had no idea was coming for me, or poorly aiming a jump under duress. There never seemed to be enough time to get my bearings since most bosses came out swinging and didn't relent until I was nothing more than toast. By the game's end, I lost count of the number of times I waved hello and goodbye to the Shaman of Corocola on the game over screen. Eventually though, with enough repetition and practice, I was able to get through these fights. Sadly, my victories never came easily to me, and many of my deaths came at the hands and the heads of these ancient beings. It was also really cool that not all the battle stages ended in a fight like this, which I thought was another really refreshing aspect to this game. While I was limping to the finish line, I never knew if I was going to wander into a full-on assault or just have to step on a tile to open a door to exit and get back to the travel stage. This kept the suspense running nice and high the entire time, which I thought was brilliant. My favorite part of finishing the boss fights at the end of a battle stage was the little tune that played once they fell. It was such a relief to hear that song kick in, especially with how awful the sound effects were. When bosses die, they scream at the top of their lungs in a shrill and horrible way until they're finished exploding. That's at least somewhat better than the flashing you might have gotten in other games, but I think it's one of the worst sound effects that I've ever heard. That joyful little song brought about relief and was an excellent transition to the laid-back nature of roaming the islands during the travel stages. Well, that's if you made it out alive. Something unique to StarTropics was how the battle stages didn't politely fade to black and boot you out once the bosses were slain. You actually had to make your way through a couple of more rooms to trigger the auto-saving screen, with the possibility of death looming. One wrong move could potentially put you back to the start of the whole dungeon if you were riding your last life. And the amount of anxiety I had trying to get to the actual end of these places was palpable. Luckily for me, I never died on the way out, but I'm sure there are people out there that did. I'm so sorry for them. One big standout for me was StarTropics' soundtrack. There isn't a single song that overstays its welcome or does a bad job of setting the tone. So much of it is nice and chipper, with a surprising number of different songs in the travel stages. There's far more to take in than the one single town theme every time you reach a new village like in other games. This plot's packed with short little bursts of story, many of which had their own unique music, which really added some depth to the auditory experience. The battle stages were at the complete opposite end of the spectrum, since there were really only 2 or 3 songs that played there. If you're only going to have one main theme playing nearly the whole time, it had better be good. Thankfully, this one is extremely infectious. I never got sick of it, and is honestly one of the more memorable aspects of my time with this game. StarTropics was an overall positive experience for me, especially because it never took itself too seriously. I loved the setting, the eccentric story and characters, as well as all the hijinks that ensued within this peculiar little world. Most of all, though, as tough as they were for me to get through, I appreciated how cerebral the battle stages were. They took a lot of planning and strategizing, pushing my skills to their limits with experimentation. Having to repeat the dungeons as many times as I did was a persistent frustration, but that only made seeing their exits that much sweeter. The only real drawback for me was the character movement. Right up until the game's end, I felt like I was reacting to enemies out of desperation rather than intention because of the main character's sluggishness. Thankfully, the positive aspects of this game far outshine the negative ones, and I'm looking forward to seeing what its sequel holds someday.